We know everything about Russian intelligence. We've all read the John le Carré novels. We know Carla and Moscow Center. We know very little about China, and that's the veil I've tried to open in this short novella, The Tao of Deception.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm delighted to be here today with you, but also with my friend David Ignatius, who's, I believe, known to everyone as an author and a columnist, to talk to him about his latest work of fiction. The title is The Tao of Deception, which you can find in the pages of a newspaper called the Washington Post. As they used to say, if you don't get it, you don't get it. David, welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be on the other end of the microphone, so to speak.
Yes, it's also great that it's not Oh Dark 30 when you and I usually meet on the set of a certain show. So, David, let me start with the question that everybody, I'm sure, is asking himself when they hear about your latest. At what point does a short story become a novella? And at what point does a novella become a novel? What actually is a novella?
So in my book, a novella is a short novel. It's like a novel in that I wanted this to have an arc. I wanted you to see the characters unfold over time, the story have a beginning, middle, and end. In this case, it takes place over 30 years. So it's not a short story. A short story to me is just a fragment that's carefully observed. A novel, obviously, is a much broader canvas. This tries to tell a big story in a limited number of words. It's under 25,000. But I have to say that whatever you call it, it ended up being a lot of fun for the author. I've never tried anything quite like this. I owe enormous thanks to my editor, David Shipley, the editor of the opinion section, who co-conspired with me and edited this really, really brilliantly. So it was a fun project. I hope people enjoy reading it.
I certainly did. I really did enjoy it. One other technical writer's question. Did you set out to write a novella or did it become a novella en route? Just talk a little bit about the process.
I had a conversation with David Shipley, my editor, some months ago, and we got this idea that why not try serialized fiction? David said, you're a spy novelist, you're a columnist. Why don't you pull the two together and let's try something different? And we reminded ourselves that once upon a time, it was very common in magazines, less so in newspapers, but the time of Charles Dickens, famously, all of his novels were serialized. They'd come out, he actually wrote them on deadline to meet each issue's publication date. That fell away. It was something that I don't think any newspaper has done or even considered. So we thought, let's give it a try. I then thought, what is a story that I could tell in the constrained space that we had, 20 to 25,000 words. And there'd been a puzzle that I had wondered about for some years involving the takedown, the destruction of the CIA's network of informants and agents in China that began around 2010, lasted a couple of years, and just devastated what the CIA had operating in China at the time. I'd seen some journalistic accounts in the New York Times and elsewhere. I'd written some columns about it, but I'd never really felt I understood it. And it occurred to me that this is the kind of story where you're not going to get at all the facts, but you could imagine and weave and let your imagination play and tell a story that would be fun. But so that's how it began, basically with the idea, let's do something like this, and then this seemed to fit.
when it became clear that the American spy network in China was being rolled up. Uh, did you write about that as a journalist? Was this something that you've been noodling for almost 15 years now?
I wrote about it some years after it happened, and made reference to it in columns about the Chinese intelligence service. It was something that was uh, written about in the New York Times, as I say, in Foreign Policy magazine. It was mysterious. People, in the end, believed that the problem had been a Chinese mole inside the CIA. I mean, who else? How could a network have been ripped apart like that unless you had somebody at the very top, somebody like Kim Philby, famously in England, who'd disclosed the identities of these agents? It turned out, and that's one of the hinges on which my little story turns in the Tao of Deception, that it was much more complicated than that. Yes, there was a mole. There was somebody at a fairly senior level in Beijing who knew some of these secrets. But the reason the Chinese were able to be so successful was something different. It involved their ability to analyze mistakes in CIA operations, the protocols that were repeated too often, communications links that were not as secure as people thought. So I don't want to give away the story. I want you to read it and find out what people thought and then what they realized was the truth. But that was the kind of true background you can find in journalistic accounts that are out there.
No, that very much comes through. So I have to be sensitive here, not to spoil things for those who haven't had the treat
No spoilers,
of
please.
no. But then there's also some wonderful characters. You've got at least four really wonderful characters in this. The couple that's central, the Chinese figure, and the early person who changes sides, shall we say. So four compelling characters into 20, 25,000 words is a great ratio of of writing. So well done. I'm
Let me
curious.
just say, let me just say a word about each of those characters, because you're right. The story does turn on them. This short novel opens with a character named Yu Qiangsheng, who was the #2 person in the Chinese intelligence service called the Ministry of State Security. He defected, in fact, to the United States in November 1985. It was initially hushed up, but it was an enormously important defection. This guy knew all of China's secrets, and it was devastating for the Ministry of State Security. He, in my novel, right in the opening scene, meets a young CIA officer named Tom Crane, who's a fluent Chinese speaker, who's kind of assigned to him as a babysitter to listen to him, listen to his stories. Defectors are always kind of cranky, and this one is. And so Tom Crane spends a lot of time with him, hearing and understanding what it is the Chinese intelligence service has been trying to do. His wife is also a fluent Chinese speaker. She's a Mozambican Chinese of mixed ancestry, grew up in Macau. Interesting, complicated characters. So the two of them propel the story forward. And then finally, there's a woman who rises in the Ministry of State Security in the aftermath of this devastating defection by Yu Qiangsheng, who I call Ma Wei. She's very much a fictional character, but she embodies the new dynamism and success of the Chinese service. Our viewers have to realize the Chinese really have been eating our lunch. They are incredibly active in their operations. The FBI officials said a couple of years ago that they opened 2 investigations of Chinese intelligence activities every day. Imagine that, 2 a day. So Ma Wei kind of embodies that very aggressive, intense spirit. Those are my 4 characters, and we won't tell our viewers exactly what happens to them.
Mum is the word. One of the interesting things that Ma Wei said, though, was her critique of American intelligence. That somewhere along the way, if you think about the OSS in the early years of American intelligence that you've written about, and you write about more recent American intelligence, almost like many other institutions, it's a story of increasing in the book, more looking to avoid mistakes than to take risks, perhaps worried about congressional investigations, say something about that, about almost the different trajectories of China's intelligence becoming, in some ways, more like old American intelligence, and American intelligence in some ways becoming slightly more what we'd expect from a statist system.
So I think you put it well, Richard. Chinese intelligence in recent years has acted as if it had the wind at its back. It's a growing, confident, risk-taking, dynamic country. It thinks it's fated really to be dominant in the world in the way that the CIA in the United States used to feel in the 1950s and 60s. I think about my own novels. I've written with this now 12. I have a 13th that'll be published in the spring. But over the years that I've been writing about the CIA, the first novel is set in the 70s and 80s. There really has been a change. There was a kind of swashbuckling, often dangerous. Let's be honest. Sometimes arrogant and out of control CIA that basically felt it had a license to run the world. After scandals, congressional investigations, lawyers, all the things that we know about, the CIA has become more risk averse. It's more cautious. It tries to operate color within the lines, so to speak. Generally speaking, I think as Americans we'd say that that's a good thing, but it does lead to some less aggressive, less dynamic operational approach. The Chinese have been going in the other direction. They're just trying to steal everything in sight. They've been really quite successful. When you look at the growth of their defense, aerospace business, awful lot of the stuff they just ripped off from the United States and other countries around the world because of aggressive intelligence operations. So, yeah, the two lines kind of crossed. Again, I don't want an American intelligence service that isn't faithful to our democracy. I think some of the problems the CIA ended up encountering from the old swashbuckling days was that it just wasn't faithful to our American democracy. It acted more like a British intelligence service, different society, more upper class and elite, more disdainful of the rules, less like an American democratic intelligence service. Finally got really crushed for that reason. Let's not make that mistake again. But I think it is in the intelligence business. The name of the game is stealing other people's secrets. You're there to break the rules of other countries, break their laws, not to observe them.
So that raises a couple of questions for me, which is if you were to take a step back, in the period you're writing about, the US-Chinese relationship has deteriorated markedly. We came out of the last 2 decades of the Cold War. We cooperated against the Soviet Union. The first decade or so of the post-Cold War period, our economic relations were going gangbusters. And now this relationship, shall we say, is in really, really bad shape. It's almost looking for a rationale. To what extent is what you're writing about in this novella, did it contribute to that? Or is it really just a separate thing, that the relationship soured, and while it was souring, it just happened to be that you had this growing Chinese espionage against the United States that was essentially more effective than vice versa?
I think it was concurrent, not a causative factor. I had a fascinating conversation yesterday with Admiral Mike Mullen and Sue Gordon, who were the two co-chairs of a task force that you put in place when you were heading the Council on Foreign Relations on Taiwan, but by implication on the U.S.-China relationship. And it was interesting in the conversation with them to chart where we've been and where we are now. I think that your task force group was right to say that the status quo that we have with Taiwan, where we have an ambiguous policy, we don't specify exactly what we would do if China attacked, has served us well now for decades and is the right way to keep moving forward. And I was, in the area of policy with your colleagues and your task force. In this intelligence world I'm writing about, China is the ultimate hard target. I mean, it is a country that is so laced with surveillance, fixed surveillance on every street corner, surveillance in every public place, every possible meeting place. It's a very hard environment to operate in. I think the CIA is dependent, as in so many other areas, on technical collection of intelligence, signals, overhead reconnaissance, because it's so darn hard to recruit individuals. But that's a challenge going forward. It's obvious that there are all sorts of, not just secrets, as the CIA likes to say, but mysteries, things that you need to understand better the intentions of the Chinese leadership, and you can only do that by having real spies.
A lot of this book is about the Chinese rolling up of the American agents, basically Chinese people who are working for American intelligence in China. Say something, though, about how significant we think Chinese intelligence has been against us. Or actually, two questions. One is, how significant is our loss? Obviously, it's the tragedy of these people being killed and so forth after they're rolled up. What do you think, though, as a result, we have lost by not having this human intelligence? How significant is the absence of that? And secondly, where I began, how significant do you think what the Chinese have gleaned from us, not by rolling up that network, but simply what they've been able to do within the United States?
So I think the most valuable thing for China, as it was growing and expanding and seeking to become a military rival to the United States, was the secrets it was able to steal about weapons technology, about technology in general. And the Chinese have been incredibly aggressive at that. They've used principally cyber espionage. They've been inside every computer system they could find, whether it's government or defense contractors or companies that are close to defense contractors. It's stunning just how much leaked out in aerospace, in so many of these technology areas. I think we've gotten a little paranoid in worrying that the Chinese are 10 feet tall, as intelligence officers used to say about the Russians. It's not China that discovered GPT-4 and these other AI breakthroughs. That came in the United States, and I think there's a reason. It's hard to imagine that kind of AI, freewheeling, that digests every piece of information, arising in a country where citizens are not allowed to use Google search. I mean, how could you have a generative AI system in a country where you can't search the internet? It's not possible. So I think China has been successful in going after the things it identifies as important that are available through the internet. Companies are much more careful now about protecting those secrets. I think it'll be harder for China going forward. In terms of what we need, the riddle that we're all puzzling over when we think about Taiwan is, what does President Xi want to do? Does he want to attack Taiwan? Does he want to unify Taiwan by force by 2027, as he's instructed his army to be ready to do? We need to understand his intentions, and that's something you can't steal through cyber espionage. And it's crucial to our security, because our understanding of what he really intends to do will drive so many other decisions. There are instances in history, as you know, as well as I, where people ended up creating the conditions for wars that weren't necessary because they didn't understand their adversaries. And I think that's the danger with China. That's why we need spies.
So we're talking about intelligence, and intelligence is about secrets. So let me ask you what may seem like an odd question. To what extent does our obsession with secrets blind us to a larger reality? We don't need intelligence to tell us about China's demographic, the disaster they're heading towards. We don't need intelligence to tell us how Chinese economic growth is slowing down, or the failures in the Chinese real estate business, or the bubbles in their economy. So to what extent do you think that this preoccupation with secrecy in some ways has the perverse effect of blinding us to what's emerging as the reality of a China, to use your expression, that's anything but 10 feet tall, that actually has far more significant problems than many in the West seem to appreciate?
It's a great question. You should be head of the Council on Foreign Relations. So the big thing that's right in front of our nose, maybe so obvious that we don't see it, is that China is not destined necessarily to be this overwhelming, dominant economic superpower. Its population is now less than that of India. It's growing about half as fast as India. Its demographic problems, an aging workforce supported by a smaller and smaller number of active workers, is a huge problem. That's just you don't need spies to tell you that. It's right there in the numbers. We made the same mistake with the Soviet Union. We were counting missiles, warheads, endless defense calculations, and we didn't see that the Russian male population was dying younger and younger because it was a society that had chronic social problems, chronic alcoholism. It was a paper mache economy in some ways, and it took people who said, "Hey, wait a minute, CIA analysts, we're Russian emigres. Let us tell you about this country," to finally wake people up. So I think you make a great point. Um, even so, even when you understand these sort of basic fundamental demographic shifts, it's important to know intentions, because that's where the miscalculations that lead to wars begin. That you just don't see the world adequately through your adversary's eyes.
David, since you mentioned him, I feel comfortable in mentioning him. Mr. Yu, who was the deputy head of Chinese intelligence, defected and so forth. I hope I'm not spoiling anything. When his motive was not financial, in the first instance, as I understood what you were saying, he was in some ways truly unhappy with what China had become. I hope I'm doing justice to your writing. And I just wanted to raise a larger question, which is this book is about people who are, it's really willing to spy against their own country. That's essentially what American spies, intelligence personnel overseas do. They recruit locals who will provide information. What have we learned about Chinese willing to work with us? What motivates them? And it connects to the question now. Xi Jinping's China is as repressive as any China we've seen in what, 2 generations? So the question is this potentially an environment, despite everything you said about how tough it is to operate in China, that could produce more people in China willing to work with us?
It certainly is an environment in which the CIA can solicit help. If you go to the CIA's website, you'll see a place where people around the world in different languages can share information that they think is important with the CIA. It's an open invitation to spy. CIA Director Burns, in a speech in London last weekend, talked about this being the greatest opportunity to recruit spies in Russia in a generation because of the disaster that Putin has created. And he said, and we're taking advantage of it. I think the same is true with China. There are a lot of Chinese people. You see this occasionally. One moment was at the end of the zero COVID policy, where Chinese were just in the streets. They were so angry and unhappy. So you see signs of this latent resistance in the system. Whether Chinese will take the huge risks in that police state of working with the United States is, very few will. Chinese are patriotic. I mean, I must, be honest. When I've traveled in China in recent years, I've been struck by the way Chinese people are excited about the new country that Xi and other leaders are creating, the China dream that they're experiencing. They're Chinese patriots. They're proud of their country. But there are a lot of people who feel that they're just not able to express themselves. Look at the Chinese internet success stories. Jack Ma, who created Alibaba, they've been basically squeezed. They're not allowed to talk. They're not allowed to run their companies anymore. They must get angry, and some of them, not the big names probably, but some of the younger people might be motivated to say, hey, the kind of world I want will be fostered by more open systems like that in America.
David, this has been available for a few days already in the Washington Post. Have you had any feedback from your buddies, your sources, in American intelligence, complained that you were too rough on them, complimented you that you got it pretty much right. What sort of feedback have you had from that set of, shall we say, secret reviewers?
So, the not as much as you might think. People, um, there's notion that people in the CIA are always blabbing to journalists, and it's just not true. They don't. If
Too
you go to the
bad.
deep side, I wish, but it ain't so. So, in terms of people on the inside, not so much. People who are outside, who are retired, seem to, from the communications I've gotten, to have enjoyed that. They're not saying this is right or wrong. They're just saying it was a good yarn, and faithful. What I try to do in my novels, Richard, is describe what intelligence officers actually do, as opposed to what you see in James Bond movies. And I think if I have a readership in the intelligence community in the U.S. and maybe around the world, it's because of that. They're realistic. They describe what people actually do. I mean, there are no martinis shaken not stirred, or stirred not shaken. I never know which in this book, because I haven't seen that much of that in real life with people like this. More Budweisers than martinis.
As long as the martinis are dry, and whether they're shaken or stirred is less safe. And when you're asked by young people, I'm curious, when you're asked by them about whether they should think about careers in intelligence, you've written about it so much. What do you tell them?
So I usually say that the same thing, that it's really important for any country, including ours, especially ours, to have a good intelligence service, and smart, capable young people, who were interested in the world, certainly should think about it. I caution them that there is a hard dividing line between the world of intelligence and certainly the world I inhabit, the world of journalism. So when you cross that line and become an intelligence officer, you're making what in some ways is a lifetime commitment. Don't think that it's a permeable, easily transited space. Um, I think when people are looking at the State Department as a career versus intelligence, it's an interesting question. The State Department is a pretty bureaucratic place sometimes. As you know, you were director of policy planning. You know our government from the inside for decades. Somebody who's more freewheeling than a button-down State Department officer is probably going to be happier in one of the intelligence agencies. It doesn't have to be the CIA. I just to say one more thing, I travel a lot around the world, and I'm struck wherever I go by just how powerful the United States continues to be. We run down this country a lot, get frustrated with it. But when you think about hard power, whether it's intelligence or military, take a stop pretty much anywhere on the globe, and it just stares you in the face. There's nothing remotely like it from any other country. So I think that's another reason that young people. I have a nephew just joined the Navy. He's loving it. He just he's a young man in his early 20s. He's having the adventure of his life, and so I'm happy for him.
So, David, you have this fascinating life where you have one David Ignatius who writes his column and analyzes and assesses the news, and then you've got this second David Ignatius who writes fiction, writes about essentially the world of espionage, of spies from the Middle East now to China. Tell us, how do you navigate these two worlds? What's it like now being you with these two very different callings?
So they're, in a sense, mutually reinforcing. In my novels, I write about things that often I encountered in my journalism, and I wanted to understand in more detail. I wanted to unpack what I thought about them, not in the 800 words of a column, but over 100,000 words, which is what my typical novels are. When I got started, you and I have been friends since the 1970s, so you'll remember this. I published my first novel in 1987. It was called Agents of Innocence, and people liked it. And I thought, okay, David, you're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to either be a novelist and focus on that, or be a journalist. But you can't. It's a fork in the road, baby. You got to make a choice. And I didn't. I just couldn't. I couldn't. I was afraid I'd never make enough money as a novelist to support my then growing family. So I continued to do both, and I now 11 novels later, I feel as if I'd made that choice, if I hadn't continued with my journalism, or if I hadn't continued writing my novels, I would have made a terrible mistake. But at the time, it's one of those things that seemed like an either or, but it really wasn't. In my case, it got to be a both and.
Well, we're fortunate that you came out there. The only bad news is we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. But I want to thank you for giving us this behind-the-scenes look at the Tao of Deception, your latest and I think compelling and readable and truly enjoyable, not novel, not short story, but novella.
Thank you, Richard.
And thanks to all of you who are watching. To learn more about upcoming programs here, please go to WashingtonPostLive.com. Try to stay cool in the heat. I'm Richard Haass, and thank you again.